Welcome to the Bayou Bingo Fantasy Network, where you'll find everything fantasy football. From rankings, sleepers, breakouts, and everything in between, we've got you covered.
Ready? And here we go!
Every episode is one step closer to you winning a championship. If your goal is to win, you're in the right place. Here's your host, Troy Lofton, right here on the Bayou Bingo Fantasy Network.
Welcome to the unveil. Let's go!
Let's go! Go!
Welcome into another video right here on the Bayou Bingo Fantasy Network. We're heading into week 3, and I'm here to break down all of the games, whether it be on Sunday, Sunday night, or even Monday Night Football. We're going to break down most of the fantasy relevant players in each and every single game, each matchup, whether they're going to be a really stud type of play or even somebody that you can put into your flex position. I can't wait to get through all of these matchups. Let's get started. All right, the first game we're going over here is the 1-1 Titans against the 1-1 Cleveland Browns. Starting here with the Titans team, we're going to go over running back Derrick Henry. Currently right now, he has 8th in fantasy points for current running backs. He's getting that bell cow usage like he's always really has gotten, you know? He's going up against the 3rd best rushing defense in the NFL. It could be a rough outing for a team that struggles to push the ball down the field. If you have Henry, you have to start him because you just know what he is and what he can provide for your teams. But you're not really happy with the situation this week. So let's move it on along to wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins, who currently ranks 48th in fantasy points among wide receivers. He's ended up playing last week even without practicing, but Hopkins is the only fantasy receiving option really on this team that I would trust to have consistent targets. You know, Treylon Burks, Nick Westbrook, Chigakonkwo, they just aren't very reliable for your team. This is going to be a rough week all over, just against a good Browns defense. I would want to stay away, but obviously if you have Henry, if you have Hopkins, you're going to be starting them on your team. Like I said, you're just not going to be happy about it. Let's switch over here to the Browns team. We're going to start over here with the running back Jerome Ford. We're currently right now 19th in fantasy points for running backs. He stepped in for the injured Chubb and he caught fire. We're talking 16 carries for 106 yards to go along with 3 catches for 25 yards and a touchdown. Ford is someone that you at least need to be putting a waiver wire claim in for if he's still available in your league by some chance. You should have gotten him here last Wednesday, but the Titans boast the 5th best rushing defense in the NFL, but Ford can also get it done out of the backfield. He should be a good option for you for the rest of the season. That's if the Browns don't end up getting someone like a veteran like, I don't know, Kareem Hunt, who they just got in here. He just signed a 1-year deal with the Browns. So what I'm really saying out here is Jerome Ford I think is going to be good this week. He's not really much scaring me as far as Kareem Hunt goes. I think he's going to kind of get into the rhythm just a little bit. This should be Jerome Ford's game, and eventually it's going to be Kareem Hunt's team. I strongly believe that Hunt is just still a good running back. So Jerome Ford definitely a start for this week, but be cautious starting next week. You should probably see more of Kareem Hunt on the field. Talking about wide receiver Amari Cooper, currently 44th in fantasy points for wide receivers. He is still the go-to wide receiver on this team. He continues to be the bright spot for this offense. Deshaun Watson needs to play better for Cooper to really shine, but as of right now, he's still producing quite well for your fantasy team. He will continue to do well this week against the 5th worst pass defense in the NFL. Get Amari Cooper in your lineup and just be glad that you have him. The other wide receiver I want to talk about here is Elijah Moore, currently 58th in fantasy points for wide receivers. I would always like to have a receiver, that's going to go against a or a terrible pass defense, and that's what you're really getting with Elijah Moore. Moore has shown to be a reliable target for Deshaun Watson thus far this season and should be a very nice flex play for you this week. As we all know, Nick Chubb likely sustained a season-ending left injury to his left knee, during the Monday night loss at Pittsburgh. So Nick Chubb, unfortunately, very scary. Prayers go up for him, but he is going to be off for the season. Looks like it's going to be Kareem Hunt and Jerome Ford really carrying the load for this team. Let's move right on to the next game. The 2-0 Falcons taking on the 1-1 Lions. We're going to start here with the Falcons at running back Bijan Robinson. He's currently third in fantasy points among running backs, and boy, has this guy really lived up to the hype, and one of the main reasons the Falcons are 2-0 right now. Last week, this dude ran for 19 times for 124 yards while also catching 4 passes for 48 yards. Robinson is absolutely electric every time he touches the ball. If you have Robinson on your fantasy team, you're just having a blast right now. Now, let's talk about the other running back here, Tyler Algier, currently 9th in fantasy points for running backs, right? Algier is getting a ton of carries in this offense, and even with Robinson going absolutely bananas, Algier is still receiving 16 carries, and Algier is just a great flex option. And if, God forbid, Robinson does sustain an injury this season, Tyler Algier, he's going to be a top option at running back at this position. So let's move on to the wide receivers here. We're talking about Drake London, currently 51st in fantasy points among wide receivers. And finally, we get to see London in the end zone this season. Week 1 is nothing short of just a massive disappointment for fantasy owners, as he made it up for that, in week 2. The problem for London, it's really not his ability. It's just that Ritter, his inability to be a good quarterback. London will always be tied to whether or not Ritter wants to suck or not, but in my opinion, you need to keep Drake London in your lineup, but just don't hold your breath. Let's move it right on along over here to the Lions, talking about quarterback Jared Goff, currently 11th in fantasy points among quarterbacks, somebody who has been playing at the top of his game this season, and that's just Jared Goff. The Falcons ranked 3rd against the pass, but look who they have faced so far this season. Week 1, we're talking about Bryce Young. Week 2, we're talking about Jordan Love. Neither of these guys are the quality as the Jared Goff, who's going to be right out and just sling the ball all over the field. I believe the Lions, even against a high-ranked pass defense, they're going to blow out. They're just going to have a blowout win. I think they're going to completely come in here and dominate. Let's talk about the running back position. Jahmyr Gibbs, currently 30th in fantasy points among opposing running backs or running backs in general in the league, with David Montgomery on the mend right now just due to that thigh injury. It's really unclear if he's even going to be available this week. As of the recording of this video, he hasn't been ruled in or out yet, but if Montgomery does not play, Gibbs will see an increase in volume against the defense that can be beaten on the ground. Falcons are the 11th worst team against the run. Playing against Gibbs is just going to be really challenging for them. This would be a very good week for Jahmyr Gibbs, even though the coach said that he's not going to come out and it's going to be a bell cow type of usage. It'll still be a running back by committee, but Gibbs will definitely get the lion's share, no pun intended, of the carries for the Lions. Now we're talking about the wide receivers here. We're talking about Amon-Ra St. Brown, currently 15th in fantasy points for wide receivers. St. Brown's an excellent route runner who's very dependable for Jared Goff. He should have a good game against the secondary. And in my opinion, this secondary has yet to be challenged with a premier wide receiver. Week 1, who's the best wide receiver they had? Adam Thielen. Week 2, what are we talking about? Jaden Reed. Neither of them even compared to the potent ability of Amon-Ra St. Brown, so just look for some fireworks. Went over to another wide receiver I do like in this game is Josh Reynolds, currently 10th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Now, I'm going to start saying by right now that Josh Reynolds, he's not going to hold up at that number 10 spot for fantasy points for wide receivers, but he is having some good games in the first 2 weeks. Probably some guy you just picked off of waivers after his week 1 performance, and he had yet another good performance in week 2. So he should be a consistent flex option for you until Jameson Williams really comes back. Just a note on David Montgomery, Coach Dan Campbell did say Monday that Montgomery is day-to-day with that thigh injury. Let's talk about the next game here. The 2-0 New Orleans Saints taking on the 1-1 Green Bay Packers. Starting at the Saints here, quarterback Derek Carr, currently 28th in fantasy points for quarterbacks. Carr is far from, a good starting fantasy quarterback, let's just be honest. But just hear me out. He has all the weapons all over the field. He can just throw up 300 yards passing in any given game, and you tack on 3 or 4 touchdowns, and boom, you got a blow-up game that nobody saw coming. You combine that with going against the Packers defense, giving up the 16th most passing yards, which is pretty much in the middle of the pack, to opposing quarterbacks, and I believe that this is a recipe for success. The defense went against Justin Fields and Desmond Ridder. Do I need to say any more? I just think that the Packers defense is probably a little bit worse than what they are right now as far as stats go. Running back, let's look at the running back position. Running back Kendre Miller, he could get his first opportunity to play and start for this team. Day 2 draft capital, pretty good that I like. He looked really good in college. I liked his film. And with Alvin Kamara just still serving his suspension for another game, and Jamal Williams possibly missing this week, the only other running back on the roster that would even get some carries we're talking about is Tony Jones Jr., who was called up for the practice squad last week. Miller is expected to be a full go at practice all week and available Sunday. You're probably going to see a mixture between Kendre Miller, Tony Jones Jr., and probably a little bit of the tight end Taysom Hill, but tight end slash quarterback slash running back slash everything else. But I don't think it'll be a workload or bell cow type of workload for any of these running backs. But just say Kendre Miller will probably be your best bet to have the most fantasy points this week if he plays. So let's go over the wide receivers here. Wide receiver Chris Olave, currently 18th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Olave's nothing really short of just an absolute stud. He has ultra smooth route running capability and has the focus, to make these outstanding catches. This week, he once again will be a prime target for fantasy points. Nothing more really needs to be said about Olave. Just get him in your lineup. Wide receiver Michael Thomas, currently 45th in fantasy points against for wide receivers. Absolutely resurrected from the dead. Thomas is by no means what he was before his injury with Drew Brees, but he's still a safe third down target for Carr. Thomas is a nice wide receiver 3 / flex play for your team. He looked really good last week. He had some nice catches, especially on third down, making nice grabs, secure grabs. I like what Thomas can give for your team, and if you can put him in your flex spot, I think you'll be good that you did. And the last wide receiver, Rashid Shaheed, 23rd in fantasy points right now for wide receivers. This guy not only gets special team points, that's if your league has that, but he can also break a 40 to 50 yard play at any given moment. This guy has flat out speed. Shaheed is a nice flex play every week. Let's just kind of think of your poor man's Gabe Davis, high floor, boomer bust type of player. And just a little note here on Jamal Williams, he does have that hamstring injury and he is expected to miss some time. If I had to guess, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. So now next wide receiver here, we're going to be talking about, let's talk about wide receiver Jaden Reed. I'm sorry. He's the 28th right now in fantasy points for wide receivers. Reed's been the biggest beneficiary of Christian Watson's absence. It's only a matter of time before Watson is back on the field. But in the meantime, if Watson is out this week, Reed should have a nice game against the Saints. Let's just say that Marshawn Lattimore should probably be blanketing Romeo Doubs, so Reed should be the best wide receiver on the Packers this week. Check back Sunday to see if Watson is even active though. That's going to make a big decision on whether or not you want to put Reed in your lineup. Quick note on Watson, he because of his hamstring was limited in practice all week long. He is still questionable as of the recording of this video to play week 3, but he does have a chance to play. So if the hamstring just lingers, the next opportunity for him to be playing is going to be week 4. And also on Aaron Jones, he also has the hamstring. Not much has really come out as of the recording of this video about his availability in week 3, but the Packers do seem to be taking a patient type of approach with all of these hamstring injuries that they're having on the team. So just be cautious again. Check the injury reports before the game so you know who to put into your lineup. The next game here, we're talking about the 0-2 Broncos taking on the 2-0 Dolphins. We're going to start here with the Broncos team. Quarterback Russell Wilson, currently 5th in fantasy points for quarterbacks. Last week, he really did help his numbers for the total season. He had 308 yards passing and 3 touchdowns against the Commanders, along with 6 carries for 56 yards. Needless to say that he had an absolute stellar performance. If Williams can continue to be productive, you should be able to see him as a fantasy relevant player. Against the Dolphins, I expect him to want to push the ball down the field more to Sutton and Judy to be able to keep pace with Tua and company. Wilson should have a solid fantasy week against the Dolphins. Now we're talking about the running back Javonte Williams here, 38th in fantasy points for running backs. Javonte Williams has yet to have that breakout type of performance that we all are really waiting on, and this week could be really the week that we see a glimpse of what we all thought was possible last season prior to his injury. The Dolphins are giving up an average of 160 yards per game on the ground, which puts them at 5th worst in the league. If there's ever a game that Williams has the opportunity to shine, it's this game. Let's talk about the wide receivers here. Talk about wide receiver Courtland Sutton, currently 36th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Courtland Sutton had another decent week last week, catching 5 balls for 66 yards. He does continue to see a healthy number of targets, and he should provide consistent numbers for your fantasy team. If you're lucky enough to have Sutton as your flex play, I'd say that your team is looking pretty good. Look for another solid outing this week against the Dolphins. The other wide receiver we're talking about is Jerry Jeudy. Now, last week was Judy's first week back from the injury and had an underwhelming day. 3 catches on 5 targets for 25 yards. It's something that we all hope finds some type of improvement. I'm going to chalk that one up for just having a little bit of rust from having that injury. Didn't play week 1, so hopefully against the Dolphins, he definitely finds more success. Another little side note to Dulcich, he was placed on the IR, so it would be quite a few weeks before we see Dulcich in action because of that hamstring injury. Moving over here to the Dolphins, quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, 6th in fantasy points for quarterbacks. Tua and the Dolphins will be taken on the Broncos team, giving up the 12th most passing yards a game, thus far this season. So when you have some heavy hitters like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, coupled with a defense giving up the 12th most passing yards to opposing quarterbacks, that's just a recipe for success. And I said it all offseason. The only downfall of Tua is his ability to stay healthy. Knock on wood. As long as he stays healthy, he's going to be pouring in those fantasy points for your team. Just be excited this week as he feasts on this juicy matchup. We're talking about here this running back now. Running back Raheem Mostert, 5th in fantasy points for running backs. Will the real Slim Shady please stand up and put one of those fingers on each hand up? Raheem Mostert is in the building. This guy came out last week and not only showed up, but he showed out. 18 carries, 121 yards, and 2 touchdowns. This dude ate up the Patriots defense, and above all, he's a top 5 running back at the moment. Did anyone even see this coming? Here he comes, the potent offense through the air. Do you think the Broncos are going to be willing to focus on stacking the box to stop Mostert? I think not. I think you're going to see a lot of nickel and dime packages, which leaves Mostert available to run wild on this defense. I love the opportunity that's presented for Mostert to continue to thrive in this role. Get Mostert in your lineups. Wide receiver Tyreek Hill, currently number 1 in fantasy points among wide receivers. Tyreek Hill is the most electrifying player in the league. This guy can give you 50 yards receiving in a game or 250 yards receiving in a game. He's shown time and time again that no matter who the quarterback is, he can light up the scoreboard for your fantasy team. Now, obviously, it's better with Tua as a quarterback, but he's shown that he can play with any quarterback. Last week, Hill had a down week with 40 yards receiving and a touchdown. But yeah, I said it right. It was a down week with 40 yards receiving and a touchdown, which most people would love to have. It's crazy to even talk about, but there's no question about Tyreek Hill, and there's no need to talk about him any longer. Just get him in your lineup, and you don't need any analysis for this guy. He's amazing. Let's talk about Jalen Waddle a little bit here. 37th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Waddle's still progressing through the concussion protocol, but I believe he should be good to go, and he should be cleared before the game, making him available. If by any means he is not, you just need to be looking at the news before kickoff just to ensure that he's playing. With concussions, you just really never know if he plays or if he's not, which I believe he will, but he's a great play as always. Get this guy in your lineup every week, no matter the matchup. The Dolphins' offense is potent. Moving on to the next game here, the 0-2 Chargers taking on the 0-2 Vikings. Quarterback Justin Herbert currently 3rd in fantasy points for four other quarterbacks. The Chargers as a whole are having an extremely disappointing start of the season. They're currently standing at 0-2 after losing to the Titans last week, and to make matters worse, they're losing one of their best players in Austin Eckler for the foreseeable future. Herbert will continue to show this fantasy dominant, really, as they just force him to use his arm to deliver these goods. So if all you care about is fantasy and not the NFL, then you're happy with Herbert and his production. This week he takes on a Vikings team that is stingy with the pass, giving up, but the fact is the Chargers have no choice but to throw the ball. He should continue to still see that success. So in order for the Chargers to keep up with the passing attack of the Vikings, you should see another 300 yards passing easily from Herbert. Get him in your lineup, guys. You just know what you get with him. He's a top quarterback. Get him in there. Talking about now the wide receiver Keenan Allen, currently 5th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Allen is showing us this season that what we all knew. As long as Allen stays healthy, he can continue to be a strong fantasy asset. Allen's going against the Vikings defense that he played the pass well thus far. The thing that the Chargers wide receivers have going on for them is that there's a lack of a running game. So in order to have that success, the Chargers are going to need to have to throw the football. More throws equal more opportunities, and more opportunities equal larger fantasy production. The other wide receiver I like here is wide receiver Mike Williams, currently 38th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Mike Williams has been nothing more than a flex play thus far this season. He's giving you a safe floor, but does possess solid touchdown upside. He's getting the target, so it's only a matter of time really before he has that breakout type of performance. Keep him in your lineup and be happy with the production he gives you. He should be a solid play this week. Little note here on Austin Eckler, the coach Brandon Staley noted that Monday that there's no really timeline for Eckler to return from that ankle injury that sidelined him in week 2, so we really don't know when he's coming back here, so just look for it to be a heavy passing game for the Chargers. Coming over here to the Vikings here, quarterback Kirk Cousins, currently number 1 in fantasy points for quarterbacks, and I have to say, Kirk Cousins has been absolutely on fire thus far this season. I mean, even though the Vikings are 0-2, Cousins is needed to handle the heavy lifting due to the lack of production on the ground. You know, this goes to show you that fantasy production doesn't always equal wins for an NFL team. But for the purposes of this video, all we care about is fantasy football, and Kirk Cousins is currently the #1 quarterback at his position. And at this point, I believe Cousins is a matchup proof, because no matter what, this offense is going to need to air the ball out just to keep up with whoever they're matching up against. Cousins finds himself in yet another good matchup this week against the team giving up the 333 yards passing per game, which is absolutely dead last in the NFL. Look for a crushing performance from this week from Cousins. Talking about running back here, Alexander Mattison currently 35th in fantasy points for running backs, and I believe this really could be the week that we see Alexander Mattison really show us something. The Chargers rank 15th in rushing yards allowed per game, which is right in the middle of the pack. They also rank dead last against the pass. I believe the Vikings are going to be scoring so many points this week that Mattison actually has his first 100 yards rushing this season. Yes, you heard it here first. The addition of Cam Akers does not scare me one bit. I believe Akers still needs to learn the playbook a bit before he's given any type of load into this offense. They already came out and said that they are still confident in Mattison and what his abilities are. Cam Akers is really just a security blanket. So if Mattison can come out and play like a beast, like we all know he will, he should be able to keep hold of his job. With some extra motivation and the addition of Akers, just look for Mattison to really get it going this week. Talking about the wide receivers now, Justin Jefferson currently 4th in fantasy points for wide receivers. There's absolutely no analysis really needed for Justin Jefferson at all. He's the best wide receiver in the game right now, and not many people can even slow him down. So going against the worst pass defense in the NFL is all you need to know about this guy dominating this week. Just enjoy the fireworks. The other wide receiver here, Jordan Addison, 13th in fantasy points for wide receivers. If there's has been any rookie in the NFL who's benefited more from having an all-pro on the other side of him, that's Jordan Addison. Okay, Addison is not seeing the double coverage, and he's able to beat his defender quite often. So alongside his smooth route running and his catching radius, Addison has proven to be a reliable option for Kirk Cousins. So Addison should be a start each and every week as long as the offense continues to fire on all cylinders. Another guy that I want to place in here as well as wide receiver KJ Osborne. He is currently 52nd in fantasy points for wide receivers right now, but based on these offense and its efficiency, Osborne is a quality flex play, and he can give you a big play at any given week. If you're looking for a skinny, if you're looking a little skinny on that bench, you know, in need of a flex play, give KJ Osborne a chance. He may even help you get a win this week against the worst pass defense in the NFL. Other than that, let's talk about TJ Hawkinson, the tight end here. He is #1 right now in fantasy points for tight ends. We all know the upside of Hawkinson when he came over from the Lions last year, but I'm telling you that I'm not really surprised with the production that he's given you thus far this season. He's an easy set it and forget it type of tight end. Currently sitting at the #1 most likely because Kelsey didn't play week 1, but ride this hot hand while you can. Enjoy the ride. I think he's going to have a nice solid game this week. Let's move on to the next game here. The 0-2 Patriots taking on the 1-1 Jets. Starting here at running back, Ramondre Stevenson for the Patriots. He's currently 15th in fantasy points for running backs. It looks like Elliott isn't going to be really digging into Stevenson's workload very much. After Elliott fumbled in week 1, I just knew, I told you guys, you know, he would be in the doghouse. If Stevenson continues and continues to keep getting these massive workload, I mean, he should provide us a decent fantasy production for your team. The Jets are giving up an average of 115 yards per game on the ground, which ranks 13th worst in the league. Stevenson should be able to give you a good fantasy day, even going against a good overall defense of the Jets. Talking about the wide receiver here, Kendrick Bourne, currently 21st in fantasy points for wide receivers. Kendrick Bourne has been a fantasy surprise to most people. You know, through 2 weeks of the season, he's seeing plenty of targets to give him some good fantasy production. Other than Sauce Gardner, the Jets really have been giving up a decent amount through the air, allowing 232 yards per game. So you should at least be able to see one wide receiver from the Patriots team with some sort of fantasy production. And if I was a betting man, I'd say it'd be Kendrick Bourne is the one that you should choose. Then we like your tight end. You know, tight end Hunter Henry, 2nd in fantasy points for tight ends. And it's finally here. Fantasy relevancy for Hunter Henry is once again a thing. When he came over from the Chargers a few years back, he was a very fantasy relevant tight end. I don't know if you guys remember or not, but until now, he's been kind of cockapoo, you know? Now the #2 tight end in fantasy football through 2 weeks. We can finally see him shining. You know, Mac Jones has given him plenty of targets in the game, and that should continue throughout the season. Get him in your lineup against the Jets in week 3. Let's go over the Jets team now here. Running back Breece Hall, currently 29th in fantasy points running backs. After a great week 1, week 2 looked just absolutely awful for the running game. And the Jets, the Patriots are, however, giving up 121 yards rushing a game, which does bode well for Hall. He can break out at any given play as he's shown us in week 1. Overall, you just aren't excited about Jets players right now without Aaron Rodgers and and now he's lost for the season. So if you have Breece Hall, you probably put him in your lineup, but you're not very happy about it. He did come out and say that the reason why they lost, or the reason why you saw that production, because he only had like 9 touches. So look for the Jets to get Breece Hall more involved this week. Look at the wide receiver position. We're talking about wide receiver Garrett Wilson, currently 16th in fantasy points for wide receivers. This is quite literally one of the few bright spots on this offense. Quarterback Zach Wilson just isn't getting it done. Not sure if it's a talent issue or a coaching issue, but Garrett Wilson has shown the ability to get it done with any quarterback, even when it was, Joe Flacco or whatnot, Mike White last season. So, no matter what quarterback he has, he's pretty solid, not only this week, but for the entire season. And then last but not least, I want to plug in here tight end Tyler Conklin, 26 in fantasy points for tight end. Here's another serviceable option for you at the tight end position. Just like rookie quarterbacks using the tight end as a safety blanket, bad quarterbacks also use the tight end as a safety blanket, and that's what we're seeing from Zach Wilson. Conklin is someone that you can probably find in free agency and fill the void if you're in need of some tight end help. Next game here, the 1-1 Bills taking on the 2-0 Commanders. Starting here at the Bills, quarterback Josh Allen, 13th in fantasy points among quarterbacks. Even though Josh Allen was supposed to be a top 3 quarterback, he's had the disappointed just fantasy owners thus far. His rushing has dipped drastically and just doesn't look like the quarterback he was last year. With that being said, he's still a quarterback that you will have in your lineup, because I can guarantee that you don't have a better option. Against the Commanders, Allen should be able to move the ball efficiently enough to have a good fantasy day. I don't see him having a ceiling game, but I'm sure you'll be happy with his production in week 3. Going over the running back here, James Cook, 12th in fantasy points for running backs. I, for one, have been completely surprised with James Cook and his production thus far this season. He's getting a ton of work on the ground, and he's just delivering. The Commanders are in the middle of the pack as far as rushing yards, giving up 109 yards per game. So Cook should see a production this week. Definitely just get him in your lineup and just enjoy what he's been doing for you so far. Wide receiver Stephon Diggs, currently 9th in fantasy points for wide receivers. We all know by now what Stephon Diggs gives you and your fantasy team. He has a consistent floor, nonstop production. Diggs is pretty much just matchup proof, and you should always just have him in your lineup. And then wide receiver Gabe Davis, currently 30th in fantasy points for wide receivers. I've talked about this guy all off season. He's a boomer bust type of guy. Week 1, he was pretty much MIA, and in week 2, he gives you 6 receptions, 92 yards, and a touchdown. He's just a really good wide receiver / kind of flex play for you as in any given week, and he can just give you that ceiling game, and that's what you're looking for. Going over the Commanders here, quarterback Sam Howell, currently 12th in fantasy points for quarterbacks. Even with Sam Howell going against this Bills defense that ranks 6th fewest in passing yards allowed, I still give Howell a good chance to do well. I mean, they should be in a negative game script, which means Sam Howell will need to sling that thing. So I believe Howell is better than what most people think of him. And if he continues to develop, I can see him being a stud in this league. So talking about running back Brian Robinson Jr., currently 3rd in fantasy points for running backs. Brian Robinson has completely grabbed the reins of this offense and carried it on his back. 18 carries last week just tells me they have completely moved on from Antonio Gibson as any type of feature in this offense. Robinson he's really looked good thus far this season, and going up against the Bills team, who is towards the bottom of the league in rush defense, could spell a very good outing for Robinson in week 3. The wide receiver here I'm going to talk about here is Terry McLaurin, currently 41st in fantasy points for wide receivers, and this has to be one of the most disappointing wide receivers through 2 weeks for me personally. McLaurin has been seen to be a reliable source of fantasy points since he's been in the league. So far he has posted 2 mediocre at best games, and that's just not up to his standards. Now, this week it looks to be tough outing for him, going once again against a good pass defense, so keep your expectations lower for McLaurin and the rest of these wide receivers. Just a little bit of a side note for Logan Thomas, the tight end, is going through concussion protocol right now after that brutal head-to-head collision he had in week 2. The next game on the docket here, we're talking about 0-2 Texans against the 1-1 Jaguars. Now, the CJ Stroud right now, 18th in fantasy points for wide receivers, and CJ Stroud has been through a lot of growing pains through the first 2 games of the season. Now, while he has shown the need to learn, he has also shown some promise, and this week is a week where I can see some growth from CJ Stroud and the Texans. The Texans are playing the Jaguars, who are 8th worst in the pass defense in the NFL, and I can see Stroud, needing to throw the ball all over the field just to keep up with Lawrence and the Jaguars. So look for the best game of the season from Stroud in week 3. Next, we're talking about running back Dameon Pierce, currently 44th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Dameon Pierce continues to see the bulk of the carries for the Texans, but nothing's really been spectacular so far. This week, it doesn't get any easier for the Jaguars boast the 8th best run defense, but I would say to temper your expectations this week. And although if you have them on your team, you will have to just start them, because you're not gonna have anybody else better in your team, but you're not just jumping for joy for this matchup for Pierce. So the wide receiver here, talking about Nico Collins, currently 7th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Nico Collins has been shocking fantasy owners all season long with his stellar play. Now, as CJ Stroud's main go-to wide receiver, he's racking up the fantasy points for your team. No one in their right mind has Nico Collins, or even thought Nico Collins would be the 7th in fantasy points through 2 weeks, but here we go. Get this guy in your lineup and enjoy the ride while he is hot. Next guy we're talking about here is wide receiver Robert Woods, currently 39th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Robert Woods is nothing more than a flex play at this point in his career. He can give you a big dud, or he can give you a solid stat line for the week. This week's going against a weaker secondary. You may want to get away with just having Woods in your flex. Could give you a decent game. Talking about wide receiver Tank Dell here, 32nd in fantasy points for wide receivers. Tank Dell's another wide receiver in need of a flex spot, solely based on the situation this week. There's going to be another viable option other than Collins this week, and I'd say it's going to either be Woods, Dell, or Dalton Schultz. And speaking of Dalton Schultz, that tight end, 37th right now in fantasy points, just like what I was talking about here a minute ago with Robert Woods and Tank Dell. I'm looking for Stroud to throw the ball quite often in this matchup. Schultz could be the beneficiary. I'd say, start no more than one of these other guys here if you need some help at the tight end position. Like I said, Schultz, Woods, Dell, one of those guys other than Collins should have a good solid week. Talking about the Jaguars here, quarterback Trevor Lawrence going over 23rd in fantasy points in quarterbacks. I believe that this is the game where you can see Trevor Lawrence really shine bright for the first time this season. He's facing the Texans team that was tore up by Gardner Minshew last week, so Lawrence has a much better weapons at his disposal than Minshew did. I see Trevor Lawrence as a top-tier quarterback this week. Just get him in your lineups. Now, running back Travis Etienne, currently 20th in fantasy points for running backs. Travis Etienne, should have a decent game against this defense, but I see this being more of a passing game for the Jaguars. Etienne only had 12 carries last week, which did lead the team. I strongly think that the organization wants the ball in Lawrence's hands to control the game. You're obviously starting Etienne if you have him, but I just don't see a large fantasy output from him this week. Talking about the wide receiver here, Calvin Ridley, 25th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Calvin Ridley is a great season. He's just having a great season so far. I think that a lot of people forgot how talented this guy was when he played for the Falcons. He's the #1 go-to wide receiver for Trevor Lawrence in an offense where there are multiple quality options. Get this guy in your lineup and never question him ever again. Wide receiver Christian Kirk, 42nd in fantasy points for wide receivers. I absolutely nailed this production on the head last week. I said there's no way Kirk goes with getting no fantasy production. And what does he do? 11 receptions, 14 targets for 110 yards. Get this guy in your lineup. There's just too many weapons here just to stay away from the Jaguars. Just get Christian Kirk in your lineup. Another guy here, tight end Evan Ingram, 3rd in fantasy points for tight ends. Evan Ingram got a new deal, and he's still putting up the fantasy numbers from last year. Currently 3rd ranked tight end for fantasy points, and it doesn't look like he's going to be slowing down anytime soon, especially with the injury we're about to talk about here to Zay Jones. Evan Ingram could be a sneaky start for you this week. Like I said, sneaky or not, he's 3rd in fantasy points for tight ends. With Zay Jones, Coach Doug Peterson did say Jones is considered day-to-day with that knee injury and will undergo further testing as the week goes through. So checking on Zay Jones before the Sunday game, see if he's available for you to put into your lineups. The next game here, we're talking about Colts versus the Ravens, the 1-1 Colts and the 2-0 Ravens. Quarterback Anthony Richardson, 8th in fantasy points for quarterbacks. The Colts owner, Jim Irsay, did say that Richardson is feeling better already after leaving that Colts game, but still in that concussion protocol. It is possible that Richardson plays in week 3, but we just have to wait and see to see if if he can pass that concussion protocol. Even if Richardson does pass that protocol, though, there's still a chance that Colts will play it safe and just sit him this week. It's really up in the air, kind of 50-50 right now from what I can understand in the research that I have done. If Richardson is a starter, you need to keep your eyes glued to the news Sunday morning just to see if he's in there or not. If you may have to pivot, grab Gardner Minshew just in case you may need him to slide into your lineup. Looking at the wide receiver here, Michael Pittman, 12th in fantasy points for wide receivers. And I think Michael Pittman is a safe play this week no matter who the quarterback is. Even when Minshew took over for Richardson last week, we saw Minshew target Pittman often. So I believe Pittman has a safe floor this week against the Ravens, again, no matter who the quarterback is. So let's go over the Ravens here. Quarterback Lamar Jackson, 21st in fantasy points for quarterback. Lamar Jackson set up quite nicely in this matchup. He's going against the Colts defense that's ranked 4th worst in pass defense in the NFL. He also has a strong possibility with not having to trade comparisons to young Anthony Richardson, who may have to miss the game. So look for Jackson to get hot early and pile on these fantasy points in this matchup. Start Jackson with confidence. Now we're talking about wide receiver Zay Flowers here, 31st in fantasy points for wide receivers. Zay Flowers is slowly becoming the exciting one to watch in this offense. He's shown the speed and the hands to get the job done. If you have Zay Flowers, you can easily plug this guy in. It's never a sexy play to really start this wide receiver or any wide receiver from the Ravens offense, but it's usually all Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews. But if you want to get a wide receiver for the Ravens, Zay Flowers is definitely your guy. Talking about the tight end Mark Andrews, 10th in fantasy points for tight ends. Mark Andrews came back last week and reminded us all why he is a top 3 tight end in the NFL. He currently ranks 10th, but he missed week 1. But give him some time, and I'm sure he's going to recapture that top position in the rankings. Mark Andrews is a matchup-proof tight end. He should be getting started in all leagues. Get him in your lineup. A quick note here about Odell Beckham Jr. He's not expected to miss really any time due to that ankle injury that he sustained during Sunday's win over the Bengals. So next game we're talking about here, the 0-2 Panthers taking on the 1-1 Seahawks. At the running back position for the Panthers, Miles Sanders, 31st in fantasy points for running backs. Miles Sanders is going up against the Seahawks defense that ranks 13th in rushing yards allowed per game. It may be difficult to see him having the explosive plays in this offense, although there is a shot that they may rely on more on the run game with Bryce Young being ruled out. So I still believe that Miles Sanders is he's a good start in week 3. Talking about the wide receiver Adam Thielen, currently 41st in fantasy points for wide receivers. I actually love Adam Thielen this week with Bryce Young out, which is kind of weird to say, but I just think that the veteran Andy Dalton will lean on the other veteran Thielen to connect for quite a few fantasy points this week. I'm putting my Bengals stamp approval on Adam Thielen in week 3. Talking about the tight end Hayden Hurst, 4th in fantasy points for wide receivers. On the flip side, I do think that Hayden Hurst is still a good start this week. Andy Dalton is a vet that knows how to get the ball to his playmakers. While I believe that this will be an Adam Thielen game, that doesn't mean that Hayden Hurst couldn't carve out some nice numbers this week. And just a quick note again, I touched on it briefly. Bryce Young not expected to play due to an ankle injury, and Andy Dalton is expected to be the starter this week. Going over to the Seahawks team here, quarterback Geno Smith, 17th in fantasy points for quarterbacks. Geno Smith shouldn't need to do much really this week to secure a win. The Panthers do have the 4th best pass defense in the NFL, but with some injuries already sustained on this defense, don't let that 4th rank fool you. This defense can easily be beaten, especially when you have wide receiver depth like the Seahawks do. This should be a nice game for Smith and the Seahawks. Talking about the running back Kenneth Walker, he's 10th in fantasy points for running backs. This should be a Kenneth Walker special game right here. I mean, the sales are deflating on the 0-2 Panthers. They just lost Bryce Young this week, and they boast the 8th worst run defense in the NFL. Here comes back, Kenneth Walker. That's clearly the bell cow for this team, and they're about to unleash this guy. I mean, I can see a monster game on the horizon for Kenneth Walker in week 3. Talking about wide receiver DK Metcalf, currently 29th in fantasy points for wide receivers. This could very well be a get-right game for DK Metcalf. The Panthers' defense is hurting right now, and with Andy Dalton on the other side throwing the ball, let's just say that there should be a ton of 3-and-outs just to give Seattle's offense a ton more opportunity to score fantasy points. Be happy if you have DK Metcalf in your lineup. Next wide receiver we're talking about here is Tyler Lockett, currently 26th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Tyler Lockett has been labeled as a boom or bust player for most of his career. This week is the same with all other weeks. You will always have to start Tyler Lockett just because of those chunk plays that he can give you and your team. Just hope that he can get behind the defense for a long touchdown to help you win your matchup this week. Next guy I'm talking about here is Jackson Smith-Njigba, currently 82nd in fantasy points for wide receivers. And Smith-Njigba is nothing more really than a flex play at this point. Geno Smith's been really relying more on those veterans and Metcalf and Lockett for production. Smith-Njigba's time will come. I just don't think it's just not yet. So moving on to the next game here, the 0-2 Bears taking on the 1-1 Chiefs. Starting at the Bears, wide receiver DJ Moore, 46th in fantasy points for wide receivers. DJ Moore is the only semi-bright spot on this offense. I said this all offseason that Justin Fields can't throw the ball. I mean, this is clearly the case. Do you have to start DJ Moore? Yes. Do you like starting DJ Moore? No. Going over here with the Chiefs now, we already know what to talk about. Quarterback Patrick Mahomes, 4th in fantasy points for quarterbacks. Patrick Mahomes is Patrick Mahomes. Start this guy. Now with Kelsey back in the fold, we will start to see Mahomes of old, torching defenses left and right. He should completely dominate this Bears. It's about to get UGLY, and they ain't got no alibi. They ugly. Okay, talking about Travis Kelce as well, 17th in fantasy points for tight ends. Kelce should be off of his pitch count this week, and that what a week it is to have Kelce going up against this garbage of a team. Have fun putting him in your lineup and watch these points just rack up. Next, we have the 2-0 Dallas Cowboys taking on the 0-2 Cardinals. Starting here at Dak Prescott, 26th in fantasy points for quarterbacks. The Cardinals are giving up a lot of passing yards to opposing teams this season thus far, but I don't think that Dak Prescott will be needed to carry this team to a win this week. The Cowboys defense should completely dominate, and we should see more running than throwing. Even with all that said, you have to start Prescott because of his situation. Just pray this isn't a one-quarter domination with 3/4 of defense and running the ball. Talking about the running back position, Tony Pollard, 4th in fantasy points at running back position. I think a lot of Tony Pollard's success can come due to this dominating defense that the Cowboys have. The Cowboys are seeing a ton of positive game scripts, which is letting Pollard run wild on teams. The Cardinals should be a down south beatdown this week, and Pollard should once again be a top fantasy running back this week. Wide receiver CeeDee Lamb, 11th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Now, CeeDee Lamb should have his way this week against the Cardinals team, who has absolutely no one to match up with him. This should be an easy 100+ yard game for Lamb. No analysis needed. Just plug him into your lineup, grab a sweet tea, and watch some fireworks. Talk about wide receiver Brandon Cooks. The Cowboys could get Cooks back this week. It's just another deep threat for Prescott. If Cooks can catch a bomb this week, he should be able to turn some heads. I'd get Cooks into your lineup this week against the Cardinals. He can have a big play for you and help you win a week. Let's talk about the tight end here, Jake Ferguson, 16th in fantasy points for tight ends. Jake Ferguson is just a touchdown-dependent player, in my opinion. Against the Cardinals defense, I think it's worth adding him to your lineup if you're in a pinch. I'm sure that you can pick up Ferguson from your waiver wire, get him in there, and hope he catches a touchdown. Talking about the running back position here, James Conner, currently 13th in fantasy points for running backs. Yes, James Conner is 13th among running backs this season in fantasy, but yes, you do have to start him on your team because you don't have anyone better. The sad part is that you have to go up against this scary defense of the Dallas Cowboys. Watch this game with one eye open and keep tissues close. Tears maybe start coming down your face and you don't even realize it. Let's talk about the tight end Zach Ertz, currently 9th in fantasy points for tight ends. Zach Ertz is solely here because of the targets he receives in this offense. Targets equals opportunities, and I'm telling you there will be plenty of opportunities this week for Ertz. If you're in a pinch, throw Zach Ertz into your lineup and see if you can't get 10+ targets out of him. Let's move over to Sunday Night Football. We're talking about the 1-1 Steelers taking on the 1-1 Raiders. At the running back position, Najee Harris for the Steelers, 48th in fantasy points for running backs. Finally, I can see Najee Harris having a really good, maybe even a great game. Going against the Raiders defense is currently ranked 6th worst in the league. I can see the Steelers trying to establish the run early and often. I know fantasy owners are frustrated right now. Just believe me, it's only week 3. Give it time to marinate. Start Harris this week with confidence. At the wide receiver position, we're talking about George Pickens, currently 19th in fantasy points for wide receivers. George Pickens is electric, isn't he? Just watching him go for that 71-yard touchdown last week against the Browns was just incredible. This is the type of plays you can get from this wide receiver. Start Pickens each and every week. He has a floor that's pretty high, and I think he's just really exciting to watch. Get Pickens in your lineup. Let's go over running back Josh Jacobs here, currently 33rd in fantasy points for running backs. The Raiders' offense is kind of meh at the moment. It's not an offense that I'm going out of my way to target at all. There are some big names like Josh Jacobs and Devontae Adams, but it just doesn't excite me to have them in my lineups. Good news for you is that Jacobs is going against the worst run defense in the NFL. They're currently giving up 193 yards per game on the ground. This is finally the week where you might be able to see a glimpse of what he was last season. For once, be excited that you started Jacobs. Wide receiver Devontae Adams, now 17th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Devontae Adams is a player that you have to start no matter what, just based on his name. Sometimes you may not be excited about it, but you have to do what you have to do. Adams, it has a safe floor, but long are the days of Adams and Aaron Rodgers. You just get what you get with Adams. Just a safe play pretty much at the wide receiver position with Devontae Adams. Put him in your lineup. Let's talk about wide receiver Jacoby Myers, 24th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Coach Josh McDaniel said Monday that Myers, because of a concussion, is headed in the right direction. It's still too early to know if he'll be clear for the Raiders' home opener against the Steelers on Sunday night. If he is in, then you need to start him, but just keep your eyes peeled for any information about his availability before kickoff. let's go over here to Monday Night Football. We're talking about the 2-0 Eagles taking on the 2-0 Buccaneers. Talking about quarterback Jalen Hurts, currently 9th in fantasy points for quarterbacks. We all know what Jalen Hurts is capable of, and we have to say that this is a Bucs game is a little special for Hurts. You know, he is determined just to beat these Bucs, as they've been really a thorn for Jalen Hurts throughout the years here, especially last season. Although the Bucs have no longer Tom Brady, the fact remains that the Bucs organization is a target for Hurts. Look for him to try to force his will upon them and have a dominant game. Talking about the running back DeAndre Swift, 11th in fantasy points for running backs. But let me be the first here to say that there ain't no way in tarnation you're going to see DeAndre Swift go for 28 carries and 175 yards and a touchdown ever again. Mark my words. Number one, he won't stay healthy. Number two, this offense has way too many weapons to be giving the ball to DeAndre Swift. You already saw the anger in A.J. Brown last week. This team is led by Hurts on the ground and through the air. Swift will not be brought back down to earth anytime soon. Yeah, right. Swift's being brought down to earth right now. He's done. I'm telling you right now. Put it right here on the Bayou Bengal Fantasy Network. I don't like DeAndre Swift. He's gonna get hurt soon anyway. That's just kind of MO. And it's not to say he won't have an okay game this week. I think if you're thinking for 80 yards rushing from Swift, I think that's just way too much. Let's go ahead and move it along to wide receiver A.J. Brown, currently 47th in fantasy points for wide receivers. A.J. Brown was visually upset with Hurts not giving him the ball like Devonta Smith has been getting. You know what I'm saying? Right now, I'm putting my reputation on the line. Bengal Tiger, guarantee 150 plus yards and a touchdown from A.J. Brown in this game. There is no way in HE double hockey sticks that Jalen Hurts lets his good friend A.J. Brown be upset about the lack of targets. Put Brown in your lineup, start him in all your DFS lineups, just play Brown everywhere. Let's talk about wide receiver Devonta Smith, currently 6th in fantasy points for wide receivers. As of the recording of this video, Devonta Smith has been tagged with a questionable tag for the game Monday night due to a hamstring and thigh injury, so just make sure you have a backup plan if needed, although if I had to guess right now, he should be good to go for the game time. But Smith has been on fire lately and is handsomely rewarding owners for drafting him so high. Again, just check on his health for Monday night. If he can't go, look for something like Quez Watkins. He should be the next man up in the pecking order. If you don't want to go with an Eagles wide receiver like Quez Watkins, maybe like a Van Jefferson, you might be able to get real easy. He should be available for you to pick up in the Rams game that plays later on after the Eagles game starts. So let's talk about the tight end, Dallas Goedert, 47th in fantasy points, 2 tight ends. From last year's top tight end to this year's redheaded stepchild, Dallas Goedert is stuck in quicksand, still trying to get things moving. He had 7 targets last week, only ended up with 22 yards. These dink and dunks aren't really working out very well for Goddard. Let's just all hope that he can get it going soon because he's just too good to bench. You gotta put him in your lineup. Talking about the Bucs here, wide receiver Mike Evans, currently 2nd in fantasy points to wide receivers. Boy, was I wrong about Mike Evans' situation. I had Evans labeled as a bust all offseason, and yet I'll be the first one to admit where I am wrong. You know, I knew Evans had the talent, but my issue was with Baker Mayfield. You know, Baker has never shown me the deep ball capability in my life. I mean, I say as long as Baker keeps chucking the football down the field, keep Evans in your lineup. Talking about here, wide receiver Chris Godwin, 49th in fantasy points for wide receiver. Chris Godwin is the one hurting here with all the Mike Evans love going on. Godwin is still seeing a healthy number of targets and having a nice floor for fantasy owners. Until things change with this offense, keep Godwin in your lineup. Just a little note here on Chase Edmonds, running back. Edmonds had undergone an MRI on last Monday just to determine the severity of his MCL injury, just to let you know if you had any of that issue. Talking about Monday Night Football again, the 1-1 Rams taking on the 0-2 Bengals. First off, we're talking about Matthew Stafford, currently 22nd in fantasy points for quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford has always been a solid NFL quarterback and a fantasy quarterback. It almost seems like no one wants to start him, even though he's a 300-yard monster week in and week out for the most part, you know? Just wait until this guy gets Cooper Kupp back. I mean, he had 2 wide receivers putting up in just a lot of work right now that we're going to go over here in a minute, but this guy, he needs to be in your lineup. I mean, they're going against the struggling Bengals team right now. Stafford is a really good start this week. Just start him in there. If you don't have one of these top tier quarterbacks, get Matthew Stafford in your lineup. Talking about running back Kyron Williams, 2nd in fantasy points for running backs right now. Now that Cam Akers is 100% traded to the Vikings, there is no looking over his shoulder. This is Kyron Williams' backfield. It is still up to the debate whether or not last week was a one-time wonder, but only time will tell. This week, he has an amazing matchup. Ride this guy while he is hot. Talk about wide receiver Puka Nacua, 3rd in fantasy points for wide receivers. Puka Nacua is going nuclear right now. He received 20 targets last game, and let me say that again, 20 targets. I just need to see how this offense looks with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua together. In the meantime, Puka Nacua is the target monster and a fantasy point monster. I'm starting him everywhere. Last but not least, let's talk about wide receiver Tutu Atwell, currently 20th in fantasy points for wide receivers. Tutu Atwell is starting to come alive as well. He's a very good wide receiver that is finally getting an opportunity to shine. He has an easy start this week against the Bengals. A quick little note on Cooper Kupp. Coach Sean McVay said Friday that he hopes Kupp, which is a hamstring, will be ready to play week 5 against Philadelphia, so keep that on your radar. Last but not least, let's go over the Bengals here. Quarterback Joe Burrow, currently 32nd in fantasy points for quarterbacks. Zach Taylor said Monday that it's hard to say whether or not Burrow, with a calf injury, will be available versus the Rams on Monday Night Football in week 3. Joe Burrow has been straight putrid through the first 2 weeks of the season, and that goes along with everyone else in this offense. Other than a great performance from T. Higgins last week, the Bengals offense has been forgettable. I would say that with the uncertainty of Burrow's availability Monday night, just start your next best quarterback. You can't do much worse than Burrow has been giving you anyway. Talking about the running back here, Joe Mixon, 22nd in fantasy points for running backs. Joe Mixon has been mediocre thus far this season. Now he's going up against a Rams defense that ranks 9th worst in the league, so there is an opportunity for success on Monday night. While the odds stacked against Mixon due to the lackluster performances through 2 weeks this season, the fact remains that there is an opportunity for him against the Rams defense. You should get Mixon into your lineups. Talking about the wide receivers here now, Jamar Chase, 63rd in fantasy points for wide receivers. I can just hear everybody crying right now, just who took Jamar Chase with one of their top picks in the draft this season. The Bengals offense is nowhere near what it was last season, but fret not, everyone. I'm sure Joe Burrow and the company will get this thing going sooner rather than later. As long as Burrow can control his injuries, you should be able to see the old Chase sooner rather than later. Last but not least, wide receiver T. Higgins, 22nd in fantasy points for wide receivers. T. Higgins was the only bright spot for this offense last week. It took 12 targets to get 89 yards and 2 touchdowns, but at least it happened. You have to start the entire Bengals offense. It is what it is. It's just that right now, it's just not pretty. As always, thank you for watching the video. I hope this in-depth analysis really helps you make the correct decision when you're trying to set your lineup starting this Sunday. Hit that subscribe button. We're coming out with videos all year long, every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, breaking down the Thursday night football games, some start and sits you can do, and then on every Friday, we release all of the games, all the players fantasy relevant for you, breaking everything down from injuries to who you can expect, all up to date. Guys, can't wait to see you guys on the next video. We'll see you guys next Wednesday.